Hi, everybody. So, this is Olympic Day. It's the 23rd of June, and all over the world, people are celebrating the Olympic Games. So, I thought, well, what can I do to talk about something interesting and something that comes out of my experience, my research? And so, I want to talk about every Olympic Games for which I have t shirts. So, you can see here, this is my Moscow 1980 Olympic Games, and it says actually at the bottom of it, you can't quite read it, but it says Moscow 1980. I'm helping the USA bring home the gold, which of course never happened because the USA didn't go to Moscow. This was the decade in which we saw the Moscow and LA 1984 boycotts taking place by the USA and of course Russia. And it's a remarkable period. And it's a remarkable period that still lingers on. Even in the last few weeks, we've seen conversations about the Olympic movement and it being urged to respond to the George Floyd response, where many sports around the world have, in fact, permitted athletes to protest or to express their views on the situation. And the Olympic Games has been a place where it has always, and I think partly because of that historical context and the negative impact of boycotts, has tried to protect the neutrality of the playing field to ensure that athletes can play and participate free from the concern of being either upstaged by political protest or just simply creating conflict between players and athletes who are trying to get on with their job. And it's always a very tricky question to answer as to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. So the Rule 50 in the IOC, the Olympic Charter, indicates that athletes are not permitted to protest in a number of different contexts during the Olympic game period. It doesn't say you can't express your views, but it says in those most symbolic moments, such as being on the podium or in the opening ceremony, or anything that's a designated Olympic venue, you are prohibited from protests. And these rules come out of the conviction that this is in fact what the athletes want. So this is where it gets complicated because you could say, well, there's a universal recognition that, in fact, into the Olympic Charter, there is an anti-discrimination rule. It talks about the principles and values of these concerns and upholds them and enshrines them within the Charter itself. So the Olympic movement is inherently opposed to racism and many of those civil rights issues that we consider to be important to uphold. But it doesn't still allow that action of protest to take place within these protected venues. Now, what's interesting over the last 2 decades, really, we've seen the recurrent conversation about protest. And on the one hand, what's really interesting about it is that the reason why this matters is because the Olympic Games is such an important public stage. It's due to the fact that the Olympics is symbolically important, that it sort of conveys the ideas and values that we want to hear back to ourselves, to be sure that they still matter, that in fact we need to keep fighting for them, that leads the Olympics to have the important platform that it does. But it's for that reason as well that they try to maintain this neutrality, because they want to ensure that all nations feel welcome to take part in the games. And the worst case scenario for the Olympic Committee is a situation where a nation withdraws their participation from the games because they feel that they will not be able to operate within a neutral platform. And the core principle of the Olympic Games competition is that all nations should feel welcome. So there's a real kind of precautionary approach to that rule that I think the IOC is rightly anxious to protect because it's very fragile. And so whilst there are now calls for the IOC to permit athletes to observe and make gestures about the current sort of feelings around racism that we see operating across the world, I think it's also useful to be a little bit cautious to compel them to make a response at this stage. The Tokyo Games are not going to happen until next year now. So in many respects, they don't need to cross that bridge for quite a while. But I think it all depends on really how you criticize the sort of rule within the Charter. And I think if you look at it in detail, it's apparent that the IOC doesn't wish to curtail the expression of personal views. it wishes to maintain that neutrality of the playing field for fear of it collapsing because of the permissive use of these expressions. So I kind of still think that it's important that the rule stays in place, not just to protect the playing field and the neutrality, but also because I kind of think, I'm not sure that political expressions have their social force when they are permitted. And a good example can be found at the last few Olympic Games. In fact, I discovered this for the first time in Beijing, where there were many anxieties about the Games going to China, many commentaries from organizations like Reporters Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, all talking about the fact that China is a place where its human rights standards are not where the rest of the world would like them to be, and therefore ought not to be given this title and award of hosting the Games, this beacon of hope for the world. And one of the things that the host country did, and that now remains quite common at the Olympic Games, is to have what I think have been described as protest pens. So in environments where you can go to have an organised protest. And of course, if you go to them during the Games, in fact in China it was almost impossible to locate these pens, there's nobody there. There's nobody there. When you permit the protest, it loses the significance. I think for me, the essence of a protest is that it should be against the sort of flow of information and what's permitted within society. If you simply allow it, then it loses that symbolic meaning, that fact that whoever has protested has really put themselves out on a limb to make their feelings known. So I think you could look at the Rule 50 as actually something that's there in order to safeguard those heroic acts that we now regard to be the important ones that have nudged society in the right direction. And people often talk about the 1968 Black Power salute that took place during those Games, which still is one of the most important reference points for not just discussions about racism in sport and the Olympic movement, but in society more widely. And I guess I wonder if it had been today, and if the IOC had permitted those sorts of gestures, would the importance of that gesture has been as significant as it's regarded today? I suspect that it won't. And so in many respects, the sort of the tragedy of the protester is that they are compelled to put themselves at risk in order to safeguard the impact of their message without putting themselves into a position of risk. I think they don't manage to actually get to a point where that message is heard. And it's a really tricky balance, I think, because it's clearly something that you would want institutions to simply support. We would want these organizations to say, well, we support these protesters and their sentiments, and we're going to build into our institution the recognition that in fact supports the sentiment and advances society in the right direction. But I think I want that rule to stay, because I want those symbolic gestures to remain significant. They in fact are our kind of way of calibrating our own morality. We need them in order to be sure that we're actually on the right track. And if we simply permit the protest, then we may lose that kind of insight. We may simply, I think, diminish and in a very profound way undermine the message and the sentiment by saying, well, let's just make it part of our marketing plan. And that's partly what happens, is that you have a situation where an issue becomes then almost absorbed into the institution, and you then make it part of your marketing campaign. And we've seen this for many years now in the Olympic Games, where non-discrimination and other such values, such as equal participation in sports, making sure women are present in leadership roles, have been part of the message that the Olympic movement wants to get across. But again, the worry is that if they do become part of that core construct of communications that's taking place, then you can almost lose sight of the inadequacies that remain and exist within the institution. So it's not as simple as to say that by permitting the expression of political statements or even just beliefs that we regard universally as important to uphold would allow us then to ensure that in fact this institution and its community are changing. In fact, by permitting it, we may obscure the fact that there's no change happening whatsoever. And that, for me, is the risk. So that's Moscow up until the present day. And we'll perhaps come back later in the day to talk about some other issues that are more recent. But we'll see where we end up next for the next games I want to talk about on Olympic Day.